Welcome to the Rising Tide Leadership Podcast, where we simplify the complexities of your leadership journey. So remember, this year our focus is on one powerful theme, identity and influence. And as always, make sure you're following the show, subscribe to that newsletter so you never miss an episode or insight. So today's episode feels quite a bit different. So I'm in the middle of actually closing out a decade at my current workplace, Indiana Wesleyan University. So 10 years in one place, one role, one identity in many ways. And now I'm stepping into something new, so a new season. And I'll be honest with our listeners, transitions like this have a way of surfacing questions you can usually keep buried when things feel stable. Questions like, who am I when the role I've held for so long starts to change? What roles, or what parts, I should say, of that role are actually mine to carry forward, and what was just for that season? Maybe the hardest one of all, what do I need to let go of to step fully into what's next? And those just aren't career questions, those are leadership questions. And because at some point, every leader faces this moment where clarity around your role starts to shift and adaptability isn't optional anymore, it's required. So today we're flipping things up a little bit. This is kind of different from what we normally talk about, but Mo is stepping in to kind of lead me through this conversation because this isn't theoretical for me right now. This is real time and real transition, real reflection, and really important, not just for me, for Mo, but for our listeners, and we think it's valuable. So together, we're going to unpack what it looks like to get clear on your role and how to stay adaptable when that role inevitably changes. So welcome to today's episode.
Awesome. Good intro, Scotty. Man, this is one of my favorite books that we're talking about. And why don't you introduce the book that I had you start to read, a few months ago, getting ready for this larger change than you have had to do. I mean, at the end of every year, right, there's going to be endings and beginnings, but you feel like, okay, well, now I just got to get ready for the next season. In your case, for the next sports, maybe you change a sports team that you're dealing with as an athletic trainer, but you're still at the same place. So what's the book that we read and what were your initial thoughts on that book?
Yeah, so the book that you recommended that I pick up as this transition was headed my way, and really as this transition was quickly coming. I should say that this transition's been a work in progress really for me for the last 2 to really 3 years. But as we were coming down the home stretch here, this kind of winter and spring, you recommended that I pick up, drop everything and pick up Necessary Endings by Dr. Henry St. Cloud. And he's quickly becoming one of my favorite authors. I really enjoy his works. One of his other books, Boundaries, we've talked about a lot on this podcast, and that is one of my all-time favorite books. And I love his writing style. I can't get enough of it. But overall, the book is about, trying to sum it up in a couple sentences here, but ultimately it's about how there are times in life as a leader, as an individual, where you need to end things. There are things that you have to end. You can't just let them kind of fade away, that you need to have a hard ending for things. And it's necessary for you to grow. It's necessary for you to move on, for those things to end. And so ultimately, that's what this whole book is about. And you knew that I was coming to this kind of really big ending. 10 years, a decade of being at a single place and then leaving it is a lot. And so it's a big chunk out of my life. And so you knew that this book would help me along that way.
Yeah, again, if you haven't read Necessary Endings, if you haven't read Boundaries, pick up both those books. I really did tell Scotty, I've given Scott tons of books over the years. We've read tons of books together. And then I'm always saying, hey, you need to put this one on your to read list. And it keeps getting longer and longer. And I think Scotty finally stopped getting frustrated with me, and just whenever I give him a book, puts it at the bottom. But this one, I told him, I literally said, man, you got to drop everything, whatever you're reading right now. You can still read it, but as you are getting ready, and this was probably about the beginning to the halfway point of this year. And the year, Scott's year, for those of you who don't know, college athletics it essentially goes from August-ish to the end of May, June, July-ish. So depending on what sports he's taking care of, in this case, Scott's done a lot with football over the past few years. So there's really no time off for him. And so it's easy just to roll from one season to another. And so when he was coming to this necessary ending in his life and he made the decision, he and his family said, all right, this is it. We're going to make this transition, and started talking to the people that they trust, No, a lot of people in Scott's orbit didn't believe that he was really ending. They're like, we'll believe it when we see it. And Scotty actually gave not his 2 weeks, but he gave his notice to the athletic department at what we call IWU, Indiana Wesleyan University. And people were still shocked, which is hilarious because he's been talking about it. That's why Necessary Endings is such a crucial book. And Scotty, I think that even kind of shocked you a little bit, that people were shocked. Like, Mo, I just told people today, and it was kind of weird for me because I was giving an announcement that everybody already knew, but people were still shocked. I mean, take me through that before we get started.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it definitely came as a shock. There was a time too a few years ago where I had the opportunity to receive a promotion at work that I was passed over for, and I'm not native to Indiana by any means. We've talked about that extensively on the show. I'm not native here, and I'm always looking to grow and for the next opportunity. And so when I was passed over for this promotion, in my mind, it's always been, okay, you've been passed over for promotion. We have to expect that Scott's going to want to grow, and it might not be here. And so, when that time came this year, and I said, hey, I like it's time for me to move on, and the fact that I had hinted at that for a long time, and that this wasn't my Indiana Wesleyan was not my forever home, that the shock that people still had it, I was surprised. I was surprised that people were in shock, that people were sad, that they couldn't believe I was going to move on, that that didn't understand why I was leaving such a great place. And to me, it was just a shock, because in my head I was like, man, I'm moving on because I want to grow. I'm moving on because I'm stagnant. I'm moving on because it's too comfortable for me here. And so it was quite a shock, especially for some of my closest coworkers too, where, I had made it pretty obvious through the whole year to them, like, hey, this is what this is my last year. Like, I'm going to be done. And for them to not, take that seriously. And, they were mostly the ones that said, hey, I'll believe it when I see it. And,
Yeah.
and when it finally came, they were like, wow, I can't believe you actually went through with it. And so it's like, yeah, I told you guys that this was going to be my last year. Like, wasn't shy about that. So, yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah. And I want to peel back the curtain a little bit for our audience, that for some of you might be out there thinking, well, just because you were passed over for a promotion, like, you're going to end up leaving. That's not the case at all. In fact, Scotty and I had been talking a couple of years before that, where I asked him, I said, are you in the right place? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, that your leadership lid continues to grow. At that time, Scotty, you and I had been meeting on a pretty regular basis for probably at least 7 or 8 years.
Hmm.
And, as Scott read more leadership books and took on more leadership roles and was very specific and intentional about the things that he did in the relationships that he had, both in work and outside of work, I said, man, your leadership lid is like growing, brother. Like, what are you going to do? And you were like, well, I'm not really sure. Like, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. I said, that's great. Let's start, figuring out if this is going to be a forever place for you, if this was just a season, albeit a longer season of life, right? In this case, a decade-long season. But Scott then became open to it. And so when the position came available that he didn't get, I don't think Scott was necessarily upset about that. I think it was just another indicator. And I think that's when, Scott, you really started listening to what I was saying, like, okay, Mo,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
Yeah.
That, and, to our listeners, that, you brought up a good point where, I don't want our listeners to think like this is a recent thing. That was, think about almost 3 or 4 years ago now that happened. And so it's not, I didn't get this, so I'm leaving. That happened 3 or 4 years ago. And it was one of those things where, I applied for that position, and was told that I was being given that position and everything, and, was led to believe that that position was mine. And when it didn't happen, it wasn't one of those things where I was like, well, then I'm leaving. It was one of those like, okay, like, all right, then I'm not meant to grow here. So then what is next? And trying to figure out, and I had no idea what was next. And so it really took some time to kind of figure out what was next, and conversations with you and conversations with my wife and some other close friends that I respected, and a lot of prayer, and to figure out really what was next.
Yeah. So I think the lesson for our listeners that I'd like for everybody to know, from what you can glean from Scott's, instance, and the things that he experienced and is experiencing, is nothing is ever promised. Nothing is ever to be given to you. And so I really think that was a blessing, because that allowed Scott to see things a little bit differently. And I'm glad because now Scott's got other things a lot lined up that probably wouldn't have happened if he had still said, well, I'm going to spend another decade there or so, which wouldn't have been bad. I was a great place to work. The team is great. Scotty gets along well with all of the people that he works with. Everybody likes Scott. He's the kind of guy who likes everybody. But I'm just glad that you decided, Scott, to look forward. But before we look forward to what's next, um, uh, something that I want to know is, after a decade at IWU, how's your understanding of your role revolved? And what parts of your role and realizing, what parts were essential versus just attached to the title? And how does that wrap into who you are now as you go forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. My role has somewhat evolved and devolved at the same time, so to say. When I was hired, I was 26 years old. I was still relatively fresh out of grad school, definitely fresh after 1 year at my first big boy job, so to say. I had just finished at Azusa Pacific, where I had met you in 2015. And so, but had just, moved out of California, was 26 years old. And so really kind of spent some pivotal years at Indiana Wesleyan as far as growth and development goes, going from my 20s and now being 36 years old. And so really spent pivotal years at Indiana Wesleyan. But as far as kind of my role goes, being 26 years old and starting there, all I saw with my role was kind of the black and white. What the job description said was what my role was. And so,
Yep.
the job description said, hey, you are hired as an athletic trainer. And at the time I was working with our volleyball team. I think our volleyball team, our track and field team. And I think I was working cheer when I started there. And so that was my responsibility. I was asked to be a preceptor, which for those that may not know what that is, I basically taught our undergrad athletic training students in a clinical setting of how to be an athletic trainer. And so those were my responsibilities. Other than that, it was just, make sure you're paying your bills and you're showing up to work on time and, you're buying your groceries, those are my responsibilities. And so that's pretty much what I saw my role as, showing up to work every day, make sure you're fulfilling your job requirements, whatever my job description was when I applied for the job, just make sure I'm checking and ticking all those boxes, and doing it well. And so as I've spent time there, I've kind of come to realize that my role hasn't shifted a whole lot. And so my title has changed. So I'm now what's called an associate athletic trainer. And there's a very long and funny story how that came to be. But essentially, the only reason I am called an associate athletic trainer has to do with pay raises. And that being said, the title doesn't really mean anything. And it was supposed to mean something. And at the end of the day, it ended up really meaning nothing. And it's actually kind of a running joke with a lot of our staff how our titles don't really mean a whole lot.
Yeah.
And it was merely used just to differentiate and get a pay raise, which I'm thankful for the pay raise. But yeah, but one of the biggest things that I've kind of realized as far as like the role goes itself is that I really had to make my role be something better than it was because no one was doing that for me in the organization. My job description wasn't changing. And so I really had to evolve the role how I wanted to see it evolved. And as I kind of grew as an individual and as a person, I came to realize that I love athletic training, but the parts of athletic training aren't typically the parts that people love. The parts that people love are, getting people back out onto the field and getting them healthy and things like that. And yes, that's fun, and it's a big part of athletic training and what I've done over the last 13, 15 years. But one of the things that I love the most is getting to invest in individuals, getting to build them and walk through them in a very small portion of their life, but through some of the darkest times in their life. And that is what I started to lean more into. And so I really kind of saw my role kind of shift in that. And in addition to that, being the oldest person on staff just through staffing changes that happened over the year, right now I'm the oldest person on staff. Gosh, by probably about 6 years. And that includes like in years of experience as well. Just knowing that I don't even have the highest position of authority, but knowing that a lot of individuals on staff still look to me like I do, and knowing that my role has even shifted in that as far as helping to just lead a staff that just is young in general. And so knowing that and seeing that my role has evolved beyond the page of a document has been kind of really one of the biggest things that I've seen shift in the 10 years that I've been at Indiana Wesleyan.
Yeah, there's a Gallup study that shows that 50% of employees don't understand what is expected of them.
Mhm.
And what you just heard Scott say for our audience is that there was a lot of lack of clarity in his job over the years. And he had to figure out not what his title was, because the title really doesn't matter, as he just told you. And it is a funny story. And titles don't matter. It's really about the responsibilities that that really make you who you are. In fact, I remember when Kevin brought me on for my first job as a youth pastor, he said, "Mo, there's your job title, and then there are your actual responsibilities of what we expect of you. And I'm going to help you understand those, because the stuff we put on paper for the job description, that's not all of it." And so Scott really didn't have a lot of guidance in that. And because he was experienced, and we had a lot of conversations on that, pretty much said, well, nobody's going to tell you what to do. What do you want to do? How do you want to affect people? And Scott started affecting people positively. He's always affected people positively, but saying, oh, well, I'm going to make sure that I am a person of influence, and that I'm helping people, and I'm going to function further than my title. I'm not going to lose my identity. And I don't think that Scott and here's the takeaway. Scott is transitioning from this title, but really, Scott, and I don't even know if I've ever told you this, but this is the way that I see it. You have moved on from having an identity that is rooted in your job to understanding that this job was just an assignment, and your identity, right? Your identity in Christ, your identity as a husband and a father, and as a person who affects others through athletic training and through health and wellness, because that's your next degree is in health and wellness. Those are all part of your identity. But this last decade was not your identity. It was an assignment. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. And I think I've struggled with that identity for a while, right? And I think it's pretty common for our work to become our identity. And I think that's especially, I would say, as a society, especially in the United States, right? I was just talking to my sister-in-law. Was up this last weekend, and we were just talking about that. She works for Cummins, the engine company, and she was talking about how in the late summer their European counterparts take about 6 weeks off, because that's just what they do, and it's a normal part of their life. And how that job just doesn't become their identity to the point where they don't take that time off. They all take 6 weeks off, and how amazing would that be to just take 6 weeks off and vacation? But to think about doing that as part of a workplace culture in the United States where everybody takes 6 weeks off is just, nobody thinks about that. That just seems so foreign to us. And I mean, no pun intended. But at the same time, I think that's a lot of what happens with our identity. We get wrapped up in that workplace, and we get wrapped up in that idea. And I can say, even as an athletic trainer, that pressure is still there. Even, right now, I am lucky enough to be on paternity leave. But even being on paternity leave, you feel that pressure of not being able to cover events as an athletic trainer. You feel that pressure of not being able to help out around, and, that identity is still there at work. And so you still feel that pressure. And so being able to break away from that and realize that identity doesn't need to be in that workplace, and that really, man, that workplace is one of the least important things in life, and that influence and those conversations you get to have with people at the workplace, with people at the coffee shop. I just had a call on insurance the other day, and I talked to Denise, and I wasn't a great conversation, but man, she was really nice to talk to, and I didn't get the outcome I wanted to, but I think I was probably her favorite person to talk to that day. And I know I was able to have at least a little bit of positive influence on her, even though I didn't get the outcome I wanted. And so, that's what matters. That's what matters.
Yeah, I'd like to get back to, your role and people. We all have a role when we work somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to I want to get a little bit vulnerable here, and here's a question for us, Scotty. Where have you seen a lack of role clarity, either in your own leadership or in the organization that you're leading, IWU, or organizations in general? And if you can name that lack of role clarity, did that impact performance, or did it impact people, or both?
Yeah, I think again, I probably have two examples that come to my mind right away, and the first one of which is what I've already mentioned, and it would be when we did this shift to titles, and when we made this shift, our head athletic trainer at the time had this great plan all thought out. She had these 5 different titles, and she had different criteria on how each staff member would get there. She was a great leader, by the way, just phenomenal. Don't know if she listens to this podcast, but if she does, Mary, you were great. Loved you.
Yeah.
But she had this well thought out plan and everything. And in honesty, it was great. And there was a need and she saw that need. We had so much turnover because our salaries just weren't up to industry standard. And so she created this system to where we could work towards getting to that standard. She brought it before our board at the university, and the board said, no. The board said, you can have 2 titles, and apart from head athletic trainer, you can have 2 titles, and you don't need any of the criteria. We don't want you to do any of that. So then we got stuck with these 2 titles that had 0 criteria that belonged to them. So then, it was, well, let's move Scott to it because he's been here long enough. So that's how I ended up with my associate title. And then we moved another individual to an associate who had been there for, I think only 2 years at the time versus I had been there 6 years at the time. And then there was no idea how anybody else would get to the same level. And so in addition, the job descriptions weren't any different between the 2 levels. I was told that, hey, yeah, the job description is the same. We just expect you to take on more responsibility. And my question was always, what does that mean? And I was vocal about that. I said, what does that mean? Can someone please define that for me? I want to be able to do my job. I want to be able to do it well, but I need clarity. And, that's something we talk about on this podcast all the time. Like you got to ask for clarity as a leader. You can't guess. And if something's confusing, ask for clarity. And it got to the point where I ended up asking our head athletic trainer, I said, hey, I need a new job description. And he was like, well, just write your own. And I said, nope. I said, sorry, I don't want to do that. I said, this isn't my responsibility. And I said, this is not my responsibility to write my own job description. And I said, I need you to write my job description for me. If you're going to, support this position. And this was a new head athletic trainer. And I said, I need you to do this. And so he wrote one up. God bless his heart. It was pretty much not any different than the other one. And so just a few minor tweaks, but overall was not a whole lot different. He added in a few things that were just conditional on things that we were currently doing. One of which was we were at the time hosting outdoor track nationals. And so one of which was, the associate, athletic trainer will, assist with the medical director of, outdoor track nationals, which was like, okay, that's great. That makes sense. This is a year-to-year thing though. So like, this isn't a continual responsibility. This is conditional. So, things like that. So it didn't provide a whole lot of role clarity, and it has created confusion within the department itself. So we've got a couple other staff athletic trainers who, do great job at their jobs, who are like, well, how do I get to associate? Am I going to get to that level? How do I get a pay raise to that level? How do I get the status and that title? And the university has said, well, there can't ever be more than 2 associates. And it's like, okay, well, but then so they just never get the pay raise. And at the same time, they're like, well, what do they exactly do that's different than us? And at the same time, I stand there and I go, they've got a really good point. We don't really do a whole lot different than what they do. And so that is one glaring instance where there just isn't a lot of clarity between the differences in roles. And it's created some issues between the athletic training staff alone. And I think, clarity on what the differences are and actually clear defined roles and differences would definitely help in that situation. So luckily the athletic training staff gets along really well together. And so it hasn't created any animosity between the staff. And so that has been very helpful. And so that definitely is a benefit. But anyway, the other kind of area that I've seen that in kind of in the other or in a different part of the organization is chain of command. That is another big area where I kind of see that lack of role clarity. We have, especially in the world of athletics, we've got, our athletics director who theoretically sits at the top of our chain of command in athletics. And then we've got our associate athletics directors. And then we've got a couple assistant athletics directors. And when it comes to the Department of athletics, when the athletics director is gone, it is pretty much a free for all. So, although in the grand scheme of things, you would think that when the athletics director is gone, the associate athletics directors are the ones that make decisions in his stead. But that is typically not what happens. So typically, if the associate tries, then and the coaches don't like the decision, they just text the athletic director. And so there's just this lack of clarity when it comes to that hierarchy. And it does not affect us too much, but it is sometimes entertaining to watch, but often frustrating as someone who enjoys structure, enjoys the hierarchy of leadership to watch. And so it's definitely interesting to see that impact performance and impact just people as individuals.
That reminds me of Amazon's single-threaded leader model, and Jeff Bezos made this up, and it's pretty incredible. But essentially, it just says one person is going to be the owner of an initiative, and there's only going to be one owner of that initiative. So there's not going to be any, unclarity or unclear expectations. Because what I hear you saying, Scotty, and again, I know all of this because we've had conversations, but a lack of clarity creates friction among a team, among persons within a team, departments as a whole. And so when there's too many voices, there's essentially no direction. Or if you have seen the movie Office Space with where Peter tells the Bobs that he has 8 different bosses, and the Bobs can't believe it. He says, "I have 8 different bosses, Bob. 8, Bob." And so his only goal throughout the day is to not get yelled at or get a memo about a TPS report, and that becomes the motivating factor. And so for leaders out there, this is what you need to know. You have to give your people clear expectations. And so as Scott moves from this role, I've told him, I'm like, look, dude, when you have conversations, because when part of necessary endings is having conversations and defining the next season with each relationship. So for instance, in Scott's situation, he's not moving. So he's still there. And a lot of people are going to think Scott's just not working here anymore, but we're still going to be best buds. That's not how it works, because we spend the most of our time with the people outside of our family, with the people that we work with. And so Scott's not going into the office every day. He may have talked to somebody every day for the past, 2, 3, 4 years or whatever. And he's not going to talk to that person, him or her, maybe, except for like 10% of what he used to. Those are the necessary endings that you have to think about, and you have to be clear. And so now I've told Scott, I'm like, it's your job to be clear in the influence that you have moving forward. And so that's what I wanted to ask about now, Scott, which is, you're stepping into a new season. What are you learning about adaptability, not just in what you do, but also in how you think as a leader?
Yeah, just to ping off what you were kind of just talking about, one of the things that my wife has been telling me just with this kind of idea of relationships and where they're going is that the idea that there's friends for a reason, there's friends for a season, and then there's friends forever. And I've had those conversations, and they're hard. So far I've had some great ones, and got some coworkers where we're in the same season of life. And so I've been able to have some great conversations so far about continuing friendships beyond once I kind of leave. But there are some others where I've had to say, hey, yeah, we're great at work, but other than that, we only talk at work. And so it's the idea that there's those friendships that we are only friends because we work together. And other than that, we're not friends outside. And so once we no longer and remove that commonality of working together, like, we won't talk. And we had a coworker of mine who, she got a new job mid-semester, and she already moved and left. And I had the conversation with her. She was actually the very first necessary ending conversation that I had. And we had that same conversation where I said, hey, like, I've loved working with you, uh, but I had to tell her, I said, hey, I don't take this the wrong way, but, I don't see us after you move staying friends. And she said, oh, I don't really see that either. And I said, okay, great. Like, we had that mutual understanding of, like, we're friends at work because we work together. But other than that, we don't share life stuff together. We don't hang out together outside of work, nothing. Versus I have another coworker who we're close at work, but our kids are about the same age. So like we've done stuff like outside of work together. We've done play dates with our kids. Like we've decided, yeah, we will stay together, or like we will hang out together. We'll stay in contact because our kids love to play together and things like that. And so those types of things make sense. So, I would say that would be a really big piece of something, or a piece of advice that I would say if you're looking at those necessary endings, really looking at, what are those friendships like? What are those ones that are going to last? I'd say one of the other things too, or as far as like adaptability goes, is you can't really have a hard plan. And I know that might be hard for a lot of people to hear, especially because it's so comforting to have a hard plan in place. Once I leave, I'm going to go do X, Y, Z, and that is what is going to happen. But you can't have a hard plan in place because stuff changes too quickly. I'm not saying don't have a plan. You should definitely have a plan. I 100% have a plan. I am not just riding off into the sunset with a hope and a prayer. But you have to be able to and willing to ebb and flow with your plan, knowing that life happens, things happen, people get sick, recessions happen, wars happen, life happens. So listen to your mentors and those that you trust, but also remember, don't listen to everyone, because as you leave and word gets out, a lot of people are going to try to give you advice on what they think you should do next. I've gotten plenty of advice from people that is just the worst advice I've ever gotten, from people that don't even know me. And so those would be, I think, kind of the two biggest things when it comes to adaptability. It just kind of that I've learned.
And leaders, that's why it's so important for you to have mentors and coaches, men and women in your life that can speak in your life, because what Scott said is something that we all go through. As soon as we make a decision to do something or not to do something, there are going to be 1,000 voices. And I remember the first time that somebody told me, this was years ago, I was in my 20s, and they said, "Man, Mo, I just think that you're making a really big mistake and wrong decision." And I literally said, well, lucky for both of us, there are 5 people in my life that I care about their opinions, and you're not one of them. So you don't have to worry about it, and I don't have to worry about it. And so, I've had a lot of fun and the privilege of being a part of Scotty's life and a lot of these decisions and the things that he's that he's done over the years, and been able to see him and his relationships grow, both in family, with his wife and now his kids, and people in the workplace, and people really take Scott's words for what they are, which is important. And there's now a lot of people that come and ask Scott for his advice. And unfortunately for those people that come to Scott, Scott has been hanging out with me long enough to where I say, Scott, there's one thing that you never do. And what is that one thing that you never do, Scott?
I never give advice anymore.
You never give advice. And the reason, leaders, you don't give advice is only 2 things could happen, and they're both bad. The first is they could take your advice, and now you're on the hook if something goes bad. Or they could not take your advice, in which case, why am I giving you my advice anyway? I just wasted my time on that. And so my job is to give people options. As Kevin always said, Mo, you've got 3 options here, or you've got 4 options. And so I started doing that with Scotty, and now Scotty does that with the people that he talks about, not because he doesn't care about them, but because he does care about them, and he wants them to make their own decisions. That's been part of Scotty's adaptability growth period of, mindset shift in the way that he does leadership. He's learned how to let go of control of a lot of the things that he wanted to control, and give his advice, his sage advice and wisdom to other people that now he knows nobody really wants your advice. And the last thing, Scotty, that I've enjoyed watching is that you have learned how to embrace uncertainty. And that's a great place to be, because when you can embrace uncertainty, nothing else can get you, because you just think, well, I had no idea that was coming. Just like you said, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the mouth, as Mike Tyson once said. And that's really what we're up against. So it's nothing's that crazy, nothing's that important. We're going to get through it. And Scott's doing a great job. And so, Scott, with that, I have one last question for you to help our audience, which is this. What's the advice that you would give a leader who knows change is coming? It's on the horizon, but they're still struggling to let go of the way things used to be.
None. I don't give advice. No, just
dang it.
No, just kidding.
No,
I'll make an exception in this time.
Yeah, Scott's going to give advice, but if you're listening to this, Scott's not giving advice to you. He's giving advice to the guy next to you, to the girl next to you. So
yes, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I have a little bit of advice, and I got some final thoughts. My biggest thing of advice is that change can be terrifying, but it also can be freeing. And if you're sitting here listening and you're like, man, Scott just seems like he has it all together, I'd just be lying to our listeners if I said that this big change isn't coming with a healthy dose of fear. I got a wife who's got a good job and like bless up that, I'm able to take this leap, but it's still terrifying, but I know I'm making the right choice for my family, for my career, for my mental, emotional health, most importantly for me. And so that's my advice right there. So remember that change can be terrifying, but it also can be just as freeing. So don't be scared to take that leap into that unknown, that leap into that fear, essentially. Uh, and then my final thoughts kind of for today, because I'm going to steal, since we are flipping the script, Mo always gets to do his final thoughts. So I'm going to do my
Take
final
it
thoughts
away.
for today.
Take it away, Scotty P. Give me the
But
good
I had
stuff.
a coworker ask me how I was feeling. We were working a track meet and she asked me how I was feeling. And this is the coworker that I spent the last, 4 or 5 years working football with. And so we've been in the trenches together. If you know anything about athletic training, working football, man, yeah, you're in the trenches working that sport together. But she asked me about how I felt about moving on. And the best way I could describe it was this. I said, it feels like I'm getting up from a really big, comfortable couch, the kind that you sink into over time, the kind that fits you just right because you spent years there. It's familiar, it's easy, it's yours. And the strange thing about seasons like this is that it's not just hard to leave something uncomfortable. Sometimes it's even harder to leave something comfortable because comfort has a way of convincing you to stay even when you know you've outgrown it. When I got passed over for that promotion, something shifted in me, not all at once, but enough to know that change was coming. I just didn't know when or where, only that staying the same was no longer an option. And there's a line from Necessary Endings, the book that we've been talking about, the book that you got to go pick up for yourself to read. Even if you're not thinking about leaving a job or anything, read it, tuck all that knowledge away. But St. Cloud says that you cannot reach the next level of success without ending something in your current life. And that's the tension. Knowing something has to end before you can clearly see what's next. Letting go of what's good so you don't miss what could be great. Because the truth is, this wasn't just about a missed opportunity. It was about an invitation to step off the couch, even when it's comfortable, an invitation to trust that growth often starts with an ending. And that's ultimately where I find myself right now, listeners. Somewhere between what was and what's next. And so those are Scott's thoughts.
Man, I love it. So listeners, what I hear, the takeaway for today is this. Look, your title might change. Your environment's definitely going to change. But great leaders are always going to stay grounded in who they are and know that their identity isn't in the title, but in who they are becoming. And so who are you becoming? It's all about the process. Don't forget the journey for the destination. You got to stay flexible. And if you're flexible, the people that you lead, they're going to stay flexible as well, and they're going to lead their people better. So if you want more content like this, make sure you head over to rtclc.com, sign up for our newsletter. It's free. We give you all the good stuff. Like, subscribe, and share. Scotty, I learned a lot today. I'm glad you read the book, and I'm glad you're having conversations for your necessary endings. And we'll talk more about what's next on the horizon for you in another episode. Thanks, brother.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for listening to the Rising Tide Leadership Podcast. Highlights and resource links are available for you in the show notes. We hope that you will join us next week as we continue on the leadership journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out, and share with others so they don't miss out. See you next week.